Hello, 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 and welcome to this week's Everyday Inclusion and Belonging, where we talk about all things diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging in the workplace and beyond, because as we all know, there's not work in life, there's just life. And I am excited, particularly given that this month we've got three major religious holidays with Easter, Passover, and Ramadan all happening, to be talking with Cody Nielsen. So Cody and I met a couple, well, I guess it's probably about a month ago now, at the Forum on Workplace Inclusion, and we immediately realized we were kindred spirits. And I told him about this and said that I really needed you to come and join me and talk about one of the topics that we're supposed to avoid in the workplace, right? Religion. So, Cody, let's just start. Give yourself a fabulous introduction that you deserve.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Cody Nielsen, as Maria has said, and I'm the founder and executive director of an organization called Convergence, or legally we're called Convergence on Campus. I am a Minnesotan who was formerly a United Methodist clergy who has over the last 5-6 years been working more on the sort of civil rights and religious inclusion space, founded Convergence in 2017 to focus on enhancing institutional climates to better support what we call religious, secular, and spiritual identities through institutional policy and practice. So that really means our focus is on the sort of systems level and the sort of institutional culture level that is respondent to both the political climates and also the legal requirements of institutions, and how do we support all different forms of religious and non-religious identities all at the same time.
Yeah, you had an epiphany, didn't you? You were on a campus and realized like it was something like the percentage of people that were on campus that were Muslim, and that like there were literally no support systems in place.
That's right. I was working at a significantly large public R1 institution, and there were over 5,000 Muslim students and over 2,000 Jewish students on campus, but not a single kosher and halal option in terms of dining and dietary options for the whole campus.
Yeah. So I think that's like we have these moments, right, that sort of send us on a trajectory. So let's talk about, I always sort of take things back to my own workplace experience. And I remember, and this is only about 10-15 years ago, there was the annual conference for an organization that I was a part of was always in September.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the top producers, like really extraordinary man, went to the leadership and said, "Hey, this is Rosh Hashanah. Like, I can't attend. And is there a way that we could in the future switch when this event happens?" And they said, "No, no, no. We've always done it the third week in September." Right. So they were unwilling to change, and not honor his faith and his, and not, on something as silly as, well, no, it's always been this week. Right. Instead of like, oh my gosh, we never considered this, that outside sort of the Christian dominant norm that this could impact somebody. And I think that's what I really want to talk about, is sort of these blinders that we put on, like that. Like, my gosh, there were literally no food options in the dining halls.
Right. And I think your example is a really classic example, and we probably see that pretty much on a daily basis if we're willing to dare I say, have eyes to see. It is so interesting because when we talk to administrators and professionals and employers, it's often one of the sort of first times that it's being introduced to them. So you may be listening to this and you may be saying, wow, I have never even considered this.
Right.
Part of the reason that happens is because, admittedly, you're part of dominant society. Like, if you're Jewish and you're listening to this, of course you're saying, of course, I deal with this every single year. But if you're not, then the question is why? And it's often because it's not important to you, or because your rights are not being sort of infringed upon.
Right.
And that might be the opening of the door to say, okay, well, who else is out there? One of the things I like to do sometimes when I present is I have this presentation. It's called Holy, 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 supporting like institutional and employee calendars for religious accommodations. And I start by telling everyone that my son is a New Year's baby, and then asking people to tell me if they know what day he's born. And if you're implicit, like if you immediately say, oh, he's a January 1 baby, which he is a January 1 baby, but if you immediately go, yeah, he's January 1, then that reveals the sort of implicit bias that we hold, because New Year's is very different for many different traditions.
Right. That's so, it's interesting. One of the things that we built into the app is we've got a calendar of all the different religious and cultural holidays. And I mean, I love it because I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't know. Like, and, always learning, and even just the amount of research that went into that, because I think we know from our own perspective, our own upbringing, our own set of beliefs, what those calendar dates are, what those holidays are, how we, what we need and what we do. I think really interesting this year with COVID-19 was perhaps the first time that people who are Christian ever felt any sort of tension around being able to celebrate, a really important religious holiday for them with Easter. Like, what do you mean I can't, like, I'm social distancing, I can't actually do something? And I hope we actually grab that perspective, those that were feeling that for the first time, and think, oh my gosh, there are probably people that I work with that's a tension that they live with all the time, because we're not set up for daily prayer, or we're not set up for food choices. There's actually a guy that I met last fall at the HR Tech Conference he's actually with LinkedIn Data Science, and he was talking about one of the things that LinkedIn had done is they'd actually had menu choices and listed if they were appropriate, right, for different, whether it's Muslim or Hindu, and he was like, that's the first time.
Right.
So.
Right. No, those are things that are so critical for us to step back. And I think your example, again, sort of going back to when is a conference held? I have seen. So there are a couple of things I want to talk about in this, in terms of like just basic level, like awareness and accommodation pieces. One, when people hold conferences, paying attention to the specific dates is so critically necessary, as well as the day of the week. So we often find that certain conferences are like, yeah, we do best when we have Thursday, Friday, Saturday conferences. And my response is, do you really understand what you're saying, in terms of this? And people are like, yeah, people want to get home on Saturday. And I'm like, because we've dominated our expression for as long as the American experience has been in existence, that Sunday is supposed to be a day off, but Saturday isn't. And that is a very different experience for certain traditions. The dietary options is also something that we see even in the most inclusive conferences. Like, we see conferences that we are sort of partners and have attended, social justice conferences. I went to a conference last April where William Barber, who's in charge of the Poor People's Movement, sort of the last piece of MLK's work, was one of the keynote speakers, along with a woman named Linda Sarsour, who's a very visible presence in the pro-Palestinian and Muslim community, who's based in New York. Both of them were keynotes, and there were over 1,500 people at this conference, and we could not find a single kosher and halal option that was even available for the participant throughout the conference. Right. The other piece of this is thinking a little bit about, from a company perspective, thinking about, you're talking about with the LinkedIn and the data scientists, how do we, when we onboard an employee or consider recruiting employees, demonstrate of value toward religious inclusion that exists. And one of the things that we often say to people is, tell me about your employee leave packages. And, of course, there are two detailed pieces. There are, of course, your vacation days and typically your sick days and your sort of the policies around sick days and days off. Maybe there's a mental health days that are there, which I would encourage as a former mental health practitioner that institutions do this. But often one of the things that we say is, well, what's your religious accommodations policy? And we often get this from the employees themselves who are subject to it. And we will hear, yeah, I can take off, for my religious holiday. And I say, well, are you taking vacation days? And they're like, well, yeah, I have to take off religious days. Does anybody make anybody take off for Christmas? No. And that's a question of Title VII, which is very interesting to me that it is not as upheld within employee institutions and businesses. And we think that one of the best ways to solve it is to add a sort of set of floating days off that specifically do give space for religious holidays.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's such an easy one. And instead of, with all of this, looking at it at the lens of how do we create this sense of belonging versus we have to do this because the law tells us to, right? Really thinking about that experience and then not having this unconscious bias around it. So let's say I'm somebody that I have daily prayer, right? And seeing that I have a choice as somebody who's a leader, who's on a team, to see that as an annoyance, or that wow, this is a part of their whole self that they're bringing here.
Right.
So I'd love to hear, best practices. I already, in the onboarding experience, right, just having some, making it clear that there are floating holidays that folks can take.
Yeah.
What are some other best practices that you would, so that we've got this religious inclusion at work?
Yeah. So I think you already hit on it a little bit around the idea around daily prayer or things like this. We really encourage employers to think really critically, especially about scheduling mandated meetings on Friday afternoons, especially early Friday afternoons.
Yep.
But instead to sort of flip the script and say to the community in very visible ways that if Friday afternoon or early Friday afternoon is a particularly important time for you, which is, we're referring back to the Muslim community for Jummah prayer, to instead make an employee practice and say, you're welcome to take that time off. It does, if employers are saying, well, there's a hardship, just simply say, work an extra hour. Don't force them to take off their lunch at the same time. There are also practices around fasting before Jummah and things like this. So I think allowing people to just have that time to both take a full lunch, but also to go to Jummah prayer and being really cautious about having mandated meetings or just sensitivity around this. Besides, nobody likes Friday afternoon meetings anyway.
Well, and I think there's also, some things around language.
Yep.
Right. I remember back in much more tone deaf days, right, saying things like sacred cow, right? So thinking about language, language and religion is, I think, there. So we already talked about, having dietary options and calling those out, right? So I'm not having to guess whether this is something that is safe for me to eat or not. Banking that time and creating flexibility around time. I love when organizations also create opportunity just for sharing.
Yes. And that can be really helpful in all capacities, but I would actually say it goes back to a question of of the ways in which we support religious literacy. So oftentimes employers will say, yeah, I know about the Jewish holidays. Yeah, I know about the Muslim holidays. Sometimes I say, but do you know why or what?
Right.
Like, so when you say, yeah, we need to provide for kosher and halal, my response is, do you actually know what that means? Do you understand, one, the importance of it, and two, what it actually means to be kosher and halal? Because often I say to people that are like struggling to be like, oh, we don't have that many Jewish or Muslim, and when I work in higher ed, I often get well, we don't have that many Jewish or Muslim students. And my response is, you don't have to be Jewish to eat kosher. Like it's
Right.
I can have a salad and be very kosher. And halal meat is not restrictive. Like, the Muslim community won't say, don't eat that meat if you're not Muslim.
Right. Not for you.
Right, exactly. So there's lots of pieces like that. I want to go back, though, because I don't want to lose that thread of other things that are there when you say things like sacred cow. Language is important. We're all in the middle of a very, very interesting moment of physical, hopefully not social, but I know that, like all of, there's a lot of this going on. I'm in the middle of writing this piece called It All Begins with the Handshake and Other Issues of Religious Inclusion in the Workplace. We think about the way in which when we're able to be together, like what we mean by employee sort of taboos or things like this. And you go to an interview and at the end of that interview, you shake the person's hand
Right.
That's how you seal the deal. I mean, we've seen our own president who had to travel, 9,000 miles away because he thought that was the most important thing, to shake Kim Jong-un's hand, in North Korea. That's another conversation for another time. But like that requirement that you shake hands with somebody is actually can be very problematic. Like you might, if you go through an interview with somebody and at the end that employer reaches to shake your hand and you, in whatever capacity, don't feel comfortable, or that it is sort of a religious requirement that you don't, that employer and the sort of bias that can get held up in that moment can create an issue of discrimination in the workplace almost immediately.
Well, and it also offers me clues on whether this is going to be a place where I really do belong.
Exactly. And I often say, I talk to people all the time. They're like, well, it was out of the best intentions and I just forgot. I understand that. How do we do better?
Yeah, I think, we talk so much in this series about the space to make mistakes.
Yep.
And the space to, again, we've got a whole section in the app that's around religions, right? And we're adding religion in, like, not just what are the top world religions, but then in practice.
Yep.
What that looks like, with, handshake or no handshake, right? Food, time, the calendar, all of those things, because if we expect perfection, we're not going to get there. So also, like, how do you create space in your interview process, as an example, or, in a team meeting, for people to be able to speak up and say, hey, you know what, based on my faith, this really isn't a comfortable practice, or right. So really making sure, and have you seen organizations, Cody, do a good job with that, where they have these really good feedback loops where people can learn?
There are really good feedback loops, and there are some businesses out there that are taking seriously the needs of these communities. We often find that companies that are sort of advancing this work are creating employee resource groups, so the ERGs that are there. The one hesitation that I have with them, and remembering, I came out of the higher ed background, and so like our sort of higher ed mindset, and my mindset never fully leaves me, is that I've certainly engaged with a number of companies that have the ERGs and the members of those ERGs, and even people that founded some of those employee resource groups. And to be really honest, sometimes they feel like when you come onto a campus and the university says, go find the Jewish group on campus so you can have solidarity marginalization. Like,
yeah. So how are you, like, how do you have advocacy and sponsorship and create that as, right, instead of like, oh my God, like, let's huddle together in our safe place.
Right. And I think that becomes sort of the critical factor. So you can create these ERGs, but you have to then take them seriously and then respond to that sort of collective wisdom and say, oh, we do need to do things. Otherwise, yeah, you're just basically tribalizing your marginalization.
Okay, so then here is, I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction, because I think it's an important one that I have heard organizations and leaders struggle with. Yeah. Somebody comes and says, my faith tells me that being gay is a sin.
Right.
So what does that look like in the workplace in terms of inclusion? Somebody saying it's my religious freedom to be to behave in a homophobic way.
Right. This is always the sticky wicket. And one of the things that we say is we want to give a space for every tradition to live out its own expression. And the reality is that we can't put people into a box. If you say, I'm Christian, and then you say, oh, I've like labeled you, this is what you are. You're homophobic, you're sexist, you know, all of these things. That may not necessarily be true. And there will be folks who do hold certain stances, as you're describing, that to be gay is a sin. The challenge of it is that we can't force people out of that belief. We can say that part of our sort of upholding of our institutional sort of like experience and climate is to say, we want to promote you to experience your own religious beliefs in the way that it is, but we don't want you to force that upon others. And that becomes the sort of question. And if we see that they would feel uncomfortable, so they would probably say they would feel uncomfortable. So in this particular situation, we're drawing out a more most likely evangelical Christian who is saying that they believe being gay is to be a sin. Not every member of the Christian community is going to believe that. Also, it's not just
right. Like, yeah, I'm for sure. But and this is a very real workplace scenario.
Absolutely. The other piece is that it's not just evangelical Christians that sort of hold that ideology all the time. There are many traditions who are that hold a similar viewpoint on that. What we find, though, is that they're not as overtly saying that. And so what we can say back to the conversation is to say, how do we uphold your abilities to practice how you believe without it infringing upon other people's? And that's the sort of like balance and the dance that we're after. You may not agree with the Muslim identifying person in their practice over here, but if you believe that we shouldn't accommodate for their religious beliefs, then why should we accommodate for yours? And so it's that give and take. We're never going to fundamentally agree on every level, nor should we.
Right.
But we do have to provide a level of religious accommodations, both legally, but also ethically. And that's sort of the American experience. And I will tell you, I have many colleagues and many people that I work with who I have fundamental disagreements with. And I also am here to like have that sort of like that tension point.
Yeah, I think that word tension is so important, because I think there's also, there also has to be fundamental respect.
Yep.
Right. I'm not going to try and change your mind. You're not going to try and change my mind. And we will, at a minimum, be respectful.
Correct. And that also doesn't, it's interesting because our diversity and inclusion statements in our companies and our institutions have to live into that. I did a
They have to be more than statements.
right. They have to be more than statements, and it might be worth people that are reviewing not reading this, sorry, that are watching this, to take a look at your company's diversity inclusion statement. So I did a study in higher ed where we looked at about 150 institutions across the US and Canada. And one of the interesting things is that we found that almost 2/3 of the institutions of higher ed that we analyzed did not include religion in their diversity and inclusion statements.
Yeah.
And we were very critical, and we called them out, and whether they were Canadian institutions or universities in the US, and we said, you're missing something. And they're like, oh, we just didn't even notice. And I'm like, that's the problem.
What's interesting is I had Becky Kukula on talking. She's from Disability In.
Okay.
And she was talking about like, what are some of the very fundamental things that you can do. And she was like, make sure you explicitly call out disability, right? So it's the same thing here. Make sure you're explicitly calling out religion.
Right.
And then having practices around that.
Right.
Simple and thoughtful, and I heard you saying, whether it's the ERGs and getting them to help inform best practices, things that you can do. So.
Exactly. And if going back to this sort of piece that we're talking about, if like gender orientation, sexual identity is included and religious identity is included in that diversity statement, then there may be a tension point. But that is part of that diversity inclusion factor, is to say, how do we do this?
Oh yeah, you don't get to any of this without it being messy and hard, and otherwise everyone is actually showing up and behaving the same way. That's not inclusion and belonging. So
right. And we know that it's going to be messy. We also know that because of its messiness, its complicatedness, and its sort of taboo in our culture, this is the reason why many people, including people that are watching this, probably have withdrawn from it. The sort of corporate, like, what's the corporate messaging that has been presented, that no, don't talk about this, we don't deal with this. And one of the things that I like to say is, find a partner in this work when you're trying to engage this. One, figure out why you're not engaging this or how you're engaging it. And two, find a partner in this who's not willing to just be there to provide the most sort of introductory, like, awareness level training, but instead like to walk you through step by step through this process, because it does take handholding. We have worked and seen organizations that have sort of worked in this space and have said, your institution knows best. We're just here to like sort of empower you. And I've said on this topic, and I think it's probably true on many topics, but especially on this topic, admittedly, most institutions don't know what's best for them, and they just don't know what to do.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit. We're coming up on time.
Sure.
We talked about thinking about scheduling.
Yeah.
Thinking about food options, thinking about language, thinking about including this in in your statements, really, having an engaged ERG. Any other best practices you want to leave us with? And then I'm going to ask you for one last truth bomb.
Sure. So those three, prayer and meditation spaces, also sort of like having those, that might be important. So I would say that those are the sort of big three. The dietary options, if you have a large enough company, or if you're in an institution that has clientele that are on campus per se, something like that. Your religious accommodations in the workplace setting, and then also your prayer and meditation, like physical environments that can be there. So those three. And then the other thing is just collection of stories and being willing for people to share. And we don't want to get into demographic data. There's some tricky stuff around collection of identities and such in this. But often we find organizations say, well, we don't have that many such and such folks. And we say, how many do you have? And they say, well, we don't actually know. And my response is, wait.
Right. I love, yeah, we one of the interviews in the app is with a woman who's originally from India, and she just talked about how much she appreciated her team
Yeah.
when there were some holidays, and how her team was like, let's, how do you want to celebrate this? Like, and they're, coming with some base knowledge, but then also like really wanting to share that with her.
Right.
I think creating that space for the stories and the shared experiences is really great. Cody,
Right.
we covered a lot of ground. I so appreciate it. Y'all, if you are not following Cody's work, I want to know as soon as you're done with that article on the handshake, send it to me, and I'll post it out here so that folks can see that. But give
Yeah.
Cody a follow. Watch the work that he's up to. It's a topic that so often we don't want to address because, like, what do we do? Well, if you don't do anything, the results aren't going to be great. So, like, run toward the fire, not away from it. So, Cody, thank you for all the work that you do.
And thank you for having me on here, and thanks for all of your audience for all of your dedication and being a part of this.
We will see you next week, everybody.